Welcome to our lecture about Internet security, weakness and targets. In this lecture, we want to speak about weaknesses of the operating systems, Unix and Linux. We want to discuss some attacks and exploits. We have already seen that errors, design errors in the programming, in the application, network application, provide attackers the possibility to break into systems. We have seen that the Internet protocols have problems that may be misused by hackers and others. And now we want to see that also operating systems provide possibilities, have weaknesses, and provide those persons that know these weaknesses, that are willing to misuse these weaknesses, the possibility to break into systems or cause some denial of service attacks. So the favorite strategy of an attacker is to take advantage of security leaks and weaknesses of computer operating systems. The favorite strategy is to use these mistakes to compromise a system. This is very effective because operating system is a basis of all other applications, communication system, and whatever that's run on a computer. Of course, the concentration here is the concentration on the most popular operating systems. That when attackers find out means to misuse, to find out weaknesses of this operating system and to develop strategies to misuse this, then the more popular the operating system is, the broader is the possibility to apply these attack methods. So due to their popularity, the Unix system, in particular Linux system, are beside of Microsoft Windows and Apple's Mac OS, the most popular operating system. So it's no wonder that the most attack methods point to overcome and to attack these three operating systems. By the way, there was in the past, when Microsoft system, Windows system was the most popular PC operating system, this was famous for security weaknesses and attack methods. But the reason was not that the Microsoft operating system was has more flaws and more security problems. The simple reason was it was the most popular system in the past. Then when Linux became more popular and even Mac OS became more popular, then immediately also attacker found means and ways to attack the other operating system. So later on we will speak about also in another lecture about weaknesses of Microsoft operating system. In this lecture we want to concentrate on Unix and in particular on Linux and want to discuss some weaknesses. So when ARPANET originally started in '69 last century, Thomson Ritchie from AT&T Bell Lab began to develop a new multi-user operating system. Multi-user operating system, and they called it Unix, with C and not with X. The Uniplex information and computing system. On this Unix with C, the famous Unix System 5 was designed. In '83, the Unix operating system was the first that comes with the Internet Protocol suite pre-installed. So this was a Unix version 4.2, the famous 4.2 BSD Unix. BSD was Berkeley Software Distribution. This was developed at the Berkeley University, and it was characterized by the integration of the TCP/IP protocol stack. So this operating system had a very important, was very important to make this internet so popular. So System 5, as well as BSD, emerged to the leading server operating systems. in the internet and intranet, and therefore they became a favorite target for hackers and Unix-based systems. Of course, like operating systems are very complex IT systems, and all IT systems have a big number of programming errors, of design errors. So also these operating systems, we can find programming and design errors in this operating system, and some of them provide really important and for the attacker successful attack points or services to break into a system. Okay, that's not the idea to break into the operating system. It is a way to break into a system with the application running on computers on the basis of this operating system. So when one starts to analyze these Unix attacks, then there is an important point to see that the appropriate configuration is very important. If this is not done correctly, then it's easy for attacker to misuse something. If we consider Linux, then all what we discuss when we discuss about attack points in Unix System 5 or BSD Unix, then the same attack can be applied to a Linux system, because Linux system is a mixture. It's a mixture out of this Unix System 5 and the BSD Unix systems. So the ideas and the weaknesses from the Unix operating systems are contained also in Linux operating system. Let's start to have a closer look at some features of this operation system, the Unix operational system, to see later on how this can be misused. In a Unix system, we have different function blocks. The kernel, famous kernel, is that part of Unix which communicates directly with the hardware. This is the idea of the operating system in general, to provide interaction possibility between the programs, application programs, and the computer hardware, and this is organized by the operating system. The kernel controls the following activities and components. The kernel controls the CPU activities. It controls the input and the output components. It controls the network functions and the access rights to the file system. These are the basic controls performed by the kernel, and it executes commands of the shells. The shell, that's a Unix command interpreter. The shell serves as the interface for accessing the kernel. The file system, another important part of an Unix operating system, the file system, is a tree-like hierarchical organization of the files. You know this very well. In Unix directories, all files, all the inputs and output devices are regarded as special files. When we discuss how to access the directory and the file in a Unix system, there are several components that are relevant for the system security. We have the user authentication and determination of access rights. So that's password, shadow. These are the Unix password files. We have already considered this when we discussed about password attacks in the lecture, in the former lecture. We have the hosts.equif. We have the PAM files. These are very important for user authentication and determination of the access rights. And then there is a recording of all the system activities. So here in the /var/log/start, there are the log files of the system, then /pros/star, there are the current system state. And we have some general config files, and this is the etc.star, all what you can find in this directory. That's the config files of the system. So these are the files and the directories for security relevant activities. The files that are responsible for user authentication and determination of the access rights, the recording, the log files, the recording of the system activities, and the general control files. Now let's have a look to some examples of attacks against Unix and Linux systems. And let's start with a discussion of an attacks at the boot time. Changing the boot media, it could be a floppy, it could be CD-ROM, and booting into another operating system makes access possible to all files on hard disk. And, for example, also access to Windows password file. So now changing the parameters of such a boot loader entry to boot into a single mode. If an attacker is able to do this, he or she gets access to all files, for example, the bootloader grub, by adding single at the end of a kernel line. What are successful countermeasures? Disable all other boot devices except hard disk. So that's not possible by putting in DVD and boot system from DVD, so that only the internal, so that the system can be booted only from the internal hard disk, and this may be configured. Then secure the BIOS by a password. So that's not easy to modify the BIOS file. This is not really secure. You can discuss in the seminar. Another countermeasure is the secure the bootloader by a password. So the attacker cannot modify the boot parameters. And then encrypt the entire hard disk, so that also this is impossible for external person, for attacker, to understand what is written there, and also in the configuration files and others, and to modify this. For password cracking, you remember this: the attacker needs access to the password file. So particularly protection measures are necessary to protect password file before attacker can access it. What are protective measures to protect password file? There are first protective measure: this password file should not be in the file domain of an anonymous internet server like FTP. Then one should avoid this Unix service NIS, this Network Information Service, that transmit configuration files and also password files between servers and clients on exposed systems. Such transformation of information is necessary so that one can also access on a distance client to the system, but one should avoid to work with this NIS service. Meanwhile, there are other methods available for example, LDAP, lightweighted DAP, and Kerberos, like it's used in Microsoft Unix, in Microsoft Office systems instead of this NIS. Have a closer look to this password attacks and how to protect the password file. There is a technique that it's known password shadowing. Instead of the encrypted password itself, Here, in this technique, a pointer is written on the password file. So not the hashed password is stored there. It is a pointer stored that is not accessible for common users. And this pointer that refers to a file with the encrypted passwords that is not accessible for common users. This should be, and this is meanwhile, the default setting in current Linux distribution. So not in older one, but in current Linux distribution, this password shadowing is the default setting. But attention, there are hacker programs like this unshadow.c, which can outwit also password shadowing by means of multiple system calls. So even this password shadowing is not ultima ratio to secure password files. Also this can be outwit, for example, with an unshadow program. Let's look to another family of attacks against Unix system by abusing the superuser ID. Superuser ID is used to execute applications with privileges to special users. So many binaries deploy the superuser ID root since they need system privilege to access to restricted resources. So here is an example how the superuser ID may be misused. This is possible on the basis of vulnerabilities of a superuser root program that is used to execute other functions which need higher privileges. So for example, the efax application needs the superuser ID bit to access modem device when the program is executed. For example, efax -d/etc/shadow. Here, an error message has been caused which shows the content of this password file. So with this vulnerability in this program, it's possible to get insights, to get access, to get shown the content of this secure password file. So an advice here, if possible, don't use superuser ID root. In this example, a more moderate permission on a modern device, on a modem device, would be possible. So not for all things superuser IDs are necessary. Of course, then you can do all, but it may be attacked, and then it's very dangerous because it allows to get access. Here, for example, with this example showing access to real secret data. Another attack idea is to abuse symbolic links. We have to remember, Unix offers several different types of links between file handles to files. We have here the handle with a normal directory registration of the file. Then we have so-called hard links that directly go from the handle, link from the handle to the file. And then we have so-called soft links in Unix, soft links that allow that handle points to a handle, and then this links to the file. These are the situation that's available in a Unix system. These are the different types of links from file handles to files. So please hold this in mind, then we see how this can be misused by attacker. The reason that it can be misused is that there are differences in the access rights between a linked file and the original file, and this can be used to cheat an application. Here is a first attack scenario. The application opens a file with apparently secured access right. But before, the attacker created a link a link from this file to another file that is readable for him. And now many applications do not check the existence of such symbolic links when they point and link to a file. So the attacker prepares a system that he misuses symbolic link mechanisms, and since many applications do not check the existence of such symbolic links, they link, and in this way gives the attacker the access to even files where high success access rights are necessary. What are protective measures against this attack scenario? The application must examine the existence of symbolic links before it opens a file. Otherwise, it's possible that an attacker, by means of misusing the symbolic link mechanism, can also see this file. Mostly, the symbolic links are misused in connection with such race conditions. Race condition we discussed in the last lecture. Here is another attack scenario that's based on the following idea. A program is running with root rights, and this program creates temporary files. So all the secret data that are computed, that are analyzed, all the intermediate results are stored in this temporary file. This temporary file, that's the idea of this attack scenario of the abuse of the symbolic link. This temporary file is redirected by a symbolic link to another file. And the goal of the attacker is that this is mostly applied for remote host files, host files, such that login becomes possible even without password. If you use this and if you have placed such symbolic links, then you can immediately access without a password. Here, the idea is that the password file is overwritten, and afterward it's simple for the attacker to break into a system. Here is another family of attacks, another idea of attacks against such Unix Linux systems. It is a breakout of the runtime environment provided by such Unix systems. The idea is within runtime environments like the change root jails of virtual machines, it is possible to bound a user to a restricted part of the file system. Just having access to files and system executables or devices chosen by the administrator. So administrator can control by this mechanism what files, what executables, what system devices he allows the user to access. Example here is, for example, the FTP servers change root. Here the users only have access to a special directory. Also Telnet or SSH users are sometimes jet rooted into their corresponding home directory, and then access is allowed, remote access is allowed. Here, it's possible to change this root director to the specified one. This is a command that it's used to change the root directory to this specified routing. The hypervisor-based virtual machines, for example, VirtualBox, Xen, VMware, are examples for such an runtime environment that's provided to the user by the administrator to perform his activities. So what is now the idea? What is the attack method to break out of such a runtime environment? Of course, because the attacker wants to access also those parts of the system that are not allowed to see. Because administrator exactly made the decision. What is allowed, what is the runtime environment, what is a part of the system the remote user can access. And the idea of the attacker is to break out of this runtime environment and to see more from the system. There are several ways, for example, injection of code into a running kernel, using an open directory handle outside from change root. Buffer overflow with shellcodes is a possibility to break it out. But also here, that's not an easy task. That's not an easy task to break out of this runtime environment. It depends. Possibilities to do this, possibilities for such breakout depend on vulnerability of the jailing system. They depend on buffer overflow, but we discussed already buffer flow attacks. They are really difficult to implement. And virtual machine monitors have a number of preventive measures to forbid attacker, to forbid user to break out of this runtime environment. Let's discuss some network and application attacks in Unix system, in Linux systems. All variants of Unix contain the Internet Protocol suite TCP/IP. This is an integral part of the operating system, and of course, beside of the IP and TCP, UDP protocol, also Internet applications are available and integrated into the operating system. Internet applications like FTP, trivial FTP, NFS, Sambas, email protocols, SMTP, POP3, or IMAP for accessing emails, domain name service, bind protocol, HTTP server, application server, Apache, Tomcat, GBoss. So remote control, ASCII-based, Telnet applications like Telnet, RLogin, RSH, RCP, SSH. So these are all integral part of such operating, of the Unix operating system, also remote procedure calls, web services, XML, RPCs, Sun remote procedure calls. And there are substantial security risks when these services and protocols are improperly installed and used. So you remember the protocols themselves have security weakness, and if this system and these networks and the services are lousily configured, then also this provides possibilities for the attacker to make a misuse. So there is a basic rule. The basic rule says install only those services that really are needed. And that the simple idea is each of the services, each of these protocols provide possibilities for attacker to attack the system. And the less system, the less protocols, the less services are running, the smaller is the number of attack possibilities. So simply by switching off an unused service, unused internet service or an unused internet protocol, unused internet application, you can decrease the danger of an attack. So basic rule, not only for Unix, but also for other systems, basic rule is to install only those services that are really required, uninstall and disable all other services. Let's have a look on attacks via RLogin or RSH in Unix-based systems. The remote R stands for this remote services of different Unix implementations, and separate remote shells are very security critical. Here is the idea of this service. The idea of this service is the configuration of a pool of computers, so-called trusted hosts, in such a way that access identification is mutually accepted. So you need to authenticate only against one of this pool of trusted hosts, and then if this accepts you, then you have access also to the other computers of the pool. So users can access each computer within this pool by merely indicating host name and user identification. Indicating only host name and user identification, but there is no additional password needed. And of course, this idea was to make it easy to cooperate with the systems, but this mechanism simply provides possibility to be attacked. So for example, for this RSH, there is no login procedure at all. So the comments are performed directly on the target computer. No authentication. And when we discussed already the spoofing attacks, we see that it's very simple to play a wrong role, falsified role in the internet. So the input of RSH hostname command executes the command on the system hostname, and the result is showing on the local terminal. Yeah? RSH hostname that designs the computer system that's used, and then the command, is performed, and the result is shown on the local desktop. The configuration as trusted host is done here in this etc/hosts.equif file or in home rhost. Now the remote commands can be executed after entry if following criteria are fulfilled. The connection is established. Connection is established by a privileged port. And the user and system must be registered in this host.equif file. Or the server in the file rhost of the user. These are the two possibilities. If the system is registered there, then access is allowed and the performance of command is allowed. The third was need to be fulfilled so that remote command can be executed after entry is that the usernames and the internet address must correspond. But also here we have seen that it's easy to modify this. It's extremely risky, particularly risky among these two methods is this file in the user's home directory. And I show you an attack scenario that makes misuse of these mechanisms. So the attacker falsify entries in the rhost file, respectively copy the rhost file in those home directories on which they have access. So they are manipulating in the pool of the trusted host. If an attacker succeeds in having access to only one of the trusted hosts, he has access to the entire pool. This is the idea. So he's able to look the weakest point to where he has the best chance to manipulate this, to falsify this rhost file or to manipulate this rhost file, then he can get access to the full whole pool of trusted hosts. What are the protective measures? Protective measures here are: do not allow this mechanism with a home rhost file at all. Better, disallow old remote applications and host-based authentication, because these mechanisms are vulnerable. Meanwhile, there are improved versions available. And then for remote access, do not use RSH, do use SSH or SCP, the secure for remote access when you want to secure your work. Let's point to another attack on the misuse of internet applications in Unix-based systems. These are network attacks based on misusing trivial FTP service, trivial FTP transfer protocol. This is a Unix service for the transfer of files without any authentication mechanisms. And this trivial file transfer runs via UDP connection. Also, UDP was this very unsecure transport control. The functionality that's provided is the first packet is a read request, contains the read request or the write request, and all further packets contain the data to be transferred and a block number so that they come into the right, that they can brought into the right correct connection. So this trivial file transfer is a very simple method to exchange information. First package says whether the user wants to write something or whether the user wants to read something, and then data are coming. So receipt of each package will be acknowledged, and a packet with a length smaller than 512 bytes indicates that it is the last packet. It's an incomplete packet, it's the last packet, and it indicates the end of the transfer. All other packets have exactly the length 512 bytes. This is a mechanism of the behind the how a trivial FTP is organized. So in here is an ABUS, the usage of a trivial FTP, which provides highest security risk. I want to show you an example. And the reason is that there is no authentication, no methods for authentication or user identification. There is no password, and the password allows to copy or transfer a password file or even an RHOS file. This is possible because there is no authentication, no passwords used. What are protective measures? Protective measures are that the trivial FTP server should only be used to transfer boot images for diskless systems. This was there one need a very simple method to start, but for all other services one should avoid to use this very insecure trivial file transfer. I already mentioned this NFS service, this network file system. In the beginning, when we saw that there is some weaknesses in. The idea of this Unix NFS service, network file service, is to allow access to files that are distributed in the network. So the user must not care where the files are located. He can get access with his network file system, access to any wished files he is allowed to have access. So this network file system makes it possible to get access to any file, whether it's located in their own computer or in a remote computer. Originally, by the way, this was developed by Sun. What are the security risks around using this network file system? In the standard configuration of this network file system, there is often a load and read access for each host. By the way, that's not true for the current Linux distribution. This was true for older Linux distribution. So standard configuration often allowed read access for each host. So authentication between the client and the server is done by the network file service with the help of so-called file handles. A file handle, that's a string that's generated by a random number generator, one for each file and each directory. Here is the authentication mechanism that's used by NFS. Before a client gets access to a directory over NFS, the host name of the client is checked for its rights concerning this directory. If the client possesses the necessary rights, it receives this file handle and is able to access this resource. The right access for the root directory is granted by a root file handle. So anyone who has such a root file handle can access the root directory and can do this permanently. What are protective measures against such attacks that are based on the network file system? First protective measure is that you should configure NFS in such a way that the export of files is only possible on local hosts, not on external hosts, not, for example, on the host of an attacker. So configuration of NFS should be done in such a way that the export of files is only possible to the local host. Another protective measure is that the export should be forbidden, the export of system file that have root read or root write rights. Also, this export should be strictly forbidden. Another protocol, another network protocol of Unix is the NTP protocol, the network time protocol. These are all attacks, all attacks from the family of network attacks in Unix, attacks that misusing weaknesses in the internet protocol and applications and how they are implemented in a Unix system. The network protocol, the network time protocol, is responsible to synchronize computer systems within a network. Because for many things, it's really important that all the systems in a network have the same watch, have the same time, and a network time protocol is using UDP port 123. There are various applications that are based on the common time basis. For example, and this makes it for security concerns so important, the authentication system. Authentication system use this network time protocol. So, for example, if a one-time password is used in an application, it works correctly only if all the systems have the same time. If an attacker is able to modify time so that the time is changed in such a way that after usage of a one-time password, watch is put back, then system cannot realize that the system, that the password was already used. So security risk here is the manipulation of the time basis is a good, provides possibilities for denial of service attack, or even for unauthorized logins, for example, by outperforming the one-time password mechanism. Here is a concrete attack scenario, a so-called masquerade. Here the time server is simulated. We have another attack scenario that's a modification, so that time messages from a time server are manipulated when they send over the network. There are so-called replay attacks. They are based on the repetition of already sent time messages. So the protocol synchronizes the time on the different systems by sending certain time messages, certain RTP messages, and here the idea of the attacker is to manipulate these messages. Then we have the interruption attacks. So here the idea is to lead the data packages of the time server so that the systems cannot be synchronized. There are the delayed attacks. The idea here is to cause overload situation within the time network, so that the time messages of the time server are delayed do not come in the right time, and then your attacker can outperform, for example, some security mechanisms that are based on time information. What are proactive protective measures against such attacks against NTP? So it's the activation of an authentication option in the current NTP implementation. So people have found out that there is a weakness, so they implemented in new versions of this, in younger versions of this NTP protocol, also some authentication mechanisms. This should be activated. So time information is sent in this way. When this authentication option is activated, time informations are sent, encrypted from the time server to the various receivers. The encryption takes place with specific keys. The key is on the receiver side. It comes from the receiver side. The receiver is able to decrypt the time message to find out the concrete time. And then the time message cannot be broadcasted because each one needs his own encryption method. Let's come to another vulnerability of Unix-based systems. These are vulnerabilities of the domain name service of the bind protocol. What is the bind? Bind is a Berkeley Internet name domain. It is the most commonly used domain name server. That's domain name server implementation that's used in the Internet. The current version is bind 9, exactly 9.4.2. That's a new implemented version which supports more features and is more secure than the older versions of bind 4 and bind 8. So when I show you now some of the attack against this bind DNS server implementation, then some of them are overcome by the actual version. So in particular, this latest version of the bind protocol, of the implementation of the domain name service supports DNSSEC. And DNSSEC is a secure variant of the domain name system, and it prevents the domain name service cache poisoning. Bind 4 and bind A offered a lot of, so the former versions of bind offered a lot of vulnerabilities, particularly security vulnerabilities, particularly on the root level. So exploiting the bind server was therefore a common attack. Here you see again that the recon to find out for an attacker what system are used on the victim system, in what version system is used, give important information to prepare an attack. So if an attacker attacks that bind 4 or bind 8 version is used, then he can run such exploits that are known for bind 4 and bind A, and then he can successfully break in or perform a denial of service attack against it. However, due to the high complexity of this application, of this domain name application, it could be expected that also the current version of bind, the bind 9 version, has vulnerabilities, and it's a question of time that attackers find out exploits to misuse this vulnerability. There is a general risk of the domain name system, and this risk is that is a plain text service. This is an information leak. There is known vulnerabilities. Also in other lectures, we already discussed some of the attacks against domain name service. Let's come to another component of an Unix system. That is the Apache. That's the most widely deployed HTTP web server. The last study says that 65% It was measured end of 2011. There's about 2/3 of all HTTP servers are Apache servers on the internet, and this is a free software, and it's available for different operation systems, and that it is often used in connection with other components. So sometimes one is speaking from the LAMP, from the LAMP that Linux run with Apache, with MySQL, with PHP, Perl, Python. So this is a typical, very common and popular installation. And we already discussed, the more popular installation is, the more attractive it is to be investigated by attackers to find out vulnerabilities and to develop attack scenarios. So for that reason, also Apache server are a goal for attackers. Although Apache from time to time has some critical remote bugs, the most attacks are caused by server misconfiguration. Not by weaknesses of the Apache system itself. It is the most attacks are based on lousily configuration of the attackers. So some basic advices which we will give at the end of the lecture can prevent this type of attacks. About attacks against web servers, we will discuss also in more detail in another lecture. The general risk here in the case of attacks against a web server is that information is stolen, so information leak, that some plain text services can be misused, information can be get out of it, that there is only a weak authentication. By default, one needs to install additional system with strong authentication methods, and there is a number of known vulnerabilities that can be misused. And I already mentioned we have a separate lecture about attacks and weaknesses of web servers later in our lecture series. Here are some, to finish the lecture, are some strategies how one can protect Unix-based system. I mentioned only a few attack methods, so only to give you an impression on what level, on which points such an operating system can be attacked, and what is particularly known for the Unix-based system, for Linux system, where the weak points are, where one can find weak points and where exploits are known to misuse these weak points. So strategies to protect such Unix system is check the installed software. Only use minimum of necessary features. So uninstall applications and services which are not used, because all these applications and services provide attack points, and if you not need this services, these applications, then you should switch off, and then immediately you have made it impossible to misuse vulnerabilities of these services. Even if systems don't contain valuable information, only use minimum installation. Otherwise, system may be hacked and misused as an attack station. So even if on your home computer is nothing important and so no much security thinking is necessary, and there are not used services available, and attackers are able to misuse this as an entry point to enter into your computer, to misuse your computer, for example, as a station in a bootnet, then, or for password cracking, then you promote insecure usage of the web. Then another protection measure is to remove all X-related software or network systems which don't need X-Windows system, email servers or web servers. Then the most Linux systems use special packaging systems so that the programs can be uninstalled easily. So you can use this. Some pre-installed systems come with more system accounts than really are needed, than in practice are needed. In order to reduce entry points, you should remove this pre-installed accounts. You should only have accounts that really are needed. So every time install latest security patches and use digital signatures when loading these patches from the internet. So if you see, many of the attacks is that people are caused to load some system, some so-called update, which is an update coming from the attacker and prepares the systems to be later attacked. Then check at least file system permissions of important places and adjust them when necessary. So check file system permissions. Files of /etc/user should not be writable. Should not be writable for anyone. Log files located here in /var/log or /var/admin should not be readable. Should not be readable to anyone. /temp, respectively /var/temp or /user/temp, should have write permissions. So for this important and security relevant files and directory entries, you should control from time to time the permissions. Then check and just adjust file permission systems also for files which anybody can write by using the following command. So find out whether there is some file that everyone can write. You can do this with this command. And then you can decide whether it's correct that everyone should be able to write on these files. Then search for programs that are shipped with a super user ID bit. You can do this by means of this command. It's very easy, and it's a successful method to check whether the system rights are set in a correct way. Then remove super user ID bit from files which don't need this permissions. This is easily done by this command, by the change mod command with the concrete file name. Then generally limit the rights of an ordinary user. So ordinary users should not be able to execute here /bin/superuser/su to become a root. It's not necessary. It should be only be possible for administrator and the root. Create appropriate groups and assign the relevant users and adjust permissions. This needs to be done carefully, and it's a big problem in large companies because people are coming and going, and there are reorganizations in the company. So often these groups are not in the correct shape, and people that already left are in, and people that do not belong longer to this group are in. So that need to be checked from time to time. It is strongly recommended to deactivate old remote commands. This points to this rlogin, RSH, security weaknesses, and generally use SSH instead of rlogin or RSC. However, also with this SSH, a password-less authentication is possible. Also, this does not solve all the security problem, and this password-less authentication access without password authentication is reason to cause some security problems, similar like with RSH or rlogin. If the attacker compromises an account containing a private key, he can get access to many other systems important information. So if RSH key authentication logs in are allowed, an attacker can log in by using captured private key, even if the administrator locked this account by changing the password string to star. This is possible because the secure shell daemon doesn't check the password file. So it's very careful. If someone lost its private key, then a very dangerous situation occurs. Protective measures to secure SSH. There you should allow only public key authentication when necessary. So an authentication less password-based should be avoided. When using public key authentication, create a file called authorized keys in the SSH directory of the user and make this file only usable for root. Some remarks and strategies to protect the domain name service and the bind implementation. It's recommended to run the DNS daemon in a change root environment in its own virtual file compartment. The bind configuration is very complex, so it's difficult to do. Here we can give only a few information about access control features. There are more to think and learn about correct configuration of such an implementation. Usually the configuration file is /etc/named.conf. In this configuration, the administrator can specify which host domain can query a DNS server for information. So these are the allow queries, which can update DNS zone status. You remember when we discussed about password attacks, so updating this DNS zone is a favorite attack goal. Here, the allow, it should be very carefully designed who is allowed to do this and who can execute the DNS zone transfer, the allow transfer. It needs to be highly protected. With such configurations, the DNS daemon can be protected from malicious attempts to update information in information to a map, the organization of the network to influence DNS information, for example, to connect a domain name service with an IP address of attacker station. Strategies to protect the Unix system, which are known under the name kernel level hardening. Here, kernel level hardening means tweak system kernelly to produce more stringent, refined, and flexible security controls. The simplest way of this kernel hardening is to disable support of modular kernels. It is very convenient only to change part of the kernel, but it is also convenient and good for the attacker and easy for the attacker to do this. So in this way, if you prevent to support this modular kernels, so the user can't insert specially written programs, such so-called kernel models, into the running kernel and execute them. This is important because otherwise an attacker could easily install a rootkit, a Trojanian program with backdoor access to later on get access to all what's happening in the system. If everything is compiled into one monolithic kernel, this makes it drastically more difficult and complicated to attack a Unix system by such kernel code insertion. The disadvantage, of course, is the recompilation of the kernel is necessary if some major hardware changes happen. There exist several scripts and programs also scripts that can be easily used within graphical user interface that verify and secure many aspects of a system. So Bastille is such a program to secure Linux system and further to educate also administrators by providing security informations and background informations. It's easy to use because it has a graphical user interface which can be used to harden a Linux system and to harden it into different categories. The file system permissions are considered the user account security, system boot security, tool disenabling, PAM configuration, so all things that are necessary to prevent these attacks we discussed in the lecture. Bastille can also enable a host-based firewall on the system to protect from network attacks. In general, Bastille consists of different Perl scripts that parse the configuration files and perform the relevant changes, so it can be recommended to harden the system. Let's finish with remarks about firewalls. There are different strategies to protect Unix systems by means of firewalls. Let's have a look to so-called host-based firewalls. It's a similar concept like the personal firewalls in the Windows-based system. The host-based firewalls under Linux try to protect workstations and servers from network attacks. So IP tables, for example, is such an firewall, such a host-based firewall. It is an example of a packet filtering firewall, which some stateful features and content inspection features. This IP tables provides a set of rules that control incoming and outgoing network traffic, and these rules are organized in groups which are called chains. IP tables, for example, can filter packets according to TCP flags or according to MAC addresses. IP table can react to certain states. For example, only allow DNS response when there was a query before, or IP tables can help to block denial of service attacks by using rate limiting for defined packets types. Remember, to avoid these attacks like the SYN flooding or others. So this personal firewall comes with a lot of features that make it possible to secure a system. Security scanner, here Nessus is a very important and comprehensive and popular system. It is a security scanner which is able to detect vulnerabilities of a computer system. It consists of a NES USD. This is the actual scanner, and Nessus. This is a client which has a graphical user interface and which is able to present the results of this security check. In a typical mode, this Nessus firstly performs a port scan. For this port scan, this Nmap, this port scanner Nmap is used, the famous port scanner. We already mentioned it in a former lecture. Or one can use also, one can perform this also with own port scan methods. Afterwards, Nessus tries various exploits, known exploits on open ports. With the help of Nessus, it is possible to easily test the own system security and identity security leaks. So it makes sense, and I'm sure that in seminar and in exercises you will work with this. Since version 3.0, Nessus isn't available anymore as a free software. It starts as an open software, free software. Now they try to make money out of it. But there are still some projects that develop on the basis of the last free available Nessus version, free available security scanners, effective security. So you have to check passwords from time to time to avoid password attacks. So here you have particularly to have a look to the password file with the password hashes that are stored in the /etc/shadow directory, and this should be controlled with a password cracker. The password cracker we already mentioned, and you have used this program John for this purpose, and John checks whether it's able to crack a password, and in this way you can see whether passwords are securely selected or not. Some Unix systems can record the password history so that users are not able to merely change between the two passwords the whole time. For example, as a standard Unix password command can be replaced by a tool like npasswd, which includes complexity checks, dictionary checks, and describing password history support, so that when the user selects a password, here this tool checks whether it's a hard password or whether it's only a weak password, and the weak passwords are not allowed, are not accepted. So information about Unix security you can find from the Computer Emergency Response Advisories. Here is a link to the CERT. Security Focus is another website where you can find a lot of information about Unix, security of Unix systems. There is a national vulnerable database from NIST with known weaknesses of Unix systems. The SANS Institute provides information to Unix security. For example, what's interesting, the top 20 vulnerabilities, so that one can check what is most commonly misused and on which point one has to particularly care to secure system. For Linux kernel security, you can here find an URL with a lot of information. You can find information about Apache security in the URL here, which is given on the slides. You can get information about the IP tables and the NetFilter system here in this URL, and the Bastille program. I mentioned the Bastille Linux tool. You can find information here. So in the recording, you can see all these URLs with more time and can access them. Thank you for your attention.